My name's Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas. This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about the rational economics of an irrational world with Tim Harford, the Undercover Economist, author of The Logic of Life.
When people think about rational choice theory and they say, oh, look, this is crazy, there's no way that people could possibly be rational, I know my reply is, well, in theory, there's no way that people could possibly catch a football. We know that if you throw a football, the path that the football describes can be expressed in terms of mathematical equations, the spin of the ball, the friction, gravitational pull. And if you were very, very smart and you had lots of time, you could actually calculate the path of the football using mathematics. But most of us actually don't have the mathematical skills to do that. And even those of us who do have the mathematical skills to do that, we could never do it quickly enough to actually catch the ball. So you could say, well, look, in theory, no one can catch a football. But, if I threw you a football, you'd catch it.
Listen to any Marketplace of Ideas interview anytime on our online archive on the website colinmarshallradio.com or download them from iTunes. Open up iTunes and search for the Marketplace of Ideas. And there you can also subscribe and get it every single week automatically.
A lot of artists. I mean, it's like, it's something, it's music that you got to touch and feel, you know what I'm saying?
My guest is Tim Harford, the Undercover Economist, author of the Slate column of the same name, the book also of the same name, the Financial Times column, Dear Economist, and now The Logic of Life, the rational economics of an irrational world. Tim, welcome to the Marketplace of Ideas.
Thanks very much. Nice to be on the show.
Now, this book comes in a tradition of economics books. It's been a good few years for economics popular works. We had Levitt's Freakonomics, Tyler Cowen's Discover Your Inner Economist, Stephen Landsberg's More Sex is Safer Sex, Robert Frank's The Economic Naturalist, your own Undercover Economist. Where does the new book, The Logic of Life, fit into that whole scheme? Where is it on the map?
Well, I think the book that it is most similar to is Freakonomics. Hopefully it'll be similar in sales, you never know. The thing that I think people really enjoyed about Freakonomics that distinguishes it from some of those other books, all of which I enjoy, by the way, and all of which I recommend, the thing that distinguishes Freakonomics is that Steve Levitt, the co-author, is an empirical economist. He goes out and he tries to find the evidence for things. He tries to actually find things out about the world. And many other economics books are in the realm of theory. They urge people to think about the world in a different way. They express economic ideas, but they're not so focused on evidence. So that I think, is one of the reasons why Freakonomics really grabbed people. Now, Steve Levitt is brilliant, but he's only one economist. He's a very creative researcher. He's very well respected. There are many, many other economists out there who are also asking questions about the way the world works. And so The Logic of Life is bringing their research to a mass audience, explaining what we're discovering. Now, the basic idea of The Logic of Life, I think, is a little different from all of these books. It's that people respond rationally to incentives. We weigh up costs and benefits. And those costs and benefits don't have to be financial at all. It could be the benefit of a romantic evening, or it could be the cost of an increased risk of a heart attack. It could be all of these things. But it turns out that we have that inner Mr. Spock, we're not aware of, who weighs up all these costs and benefits for us and helps us to make rational decisions subconsciously. That's the idea behind a lot of economic thinking. And the question I ask in The Logic of Life is, well, is it true? And that's where I tap into all of this new, quite exciting, creative economic research, asking if it's true. And it turns out, usually it is.
This is rational choice theory then applied to the situations we see every day.
Absolutely. So to give you a classic example, this comes from Gary Becker, who is really the father of rational choice theory in everyday life. Becker is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. These days he's in his mid-70s. He's a grandfather, professor at the University of Chicago. And he told a story about developing a theory of rational crime, the idea that criminals respond to costs and benefits, and particularly the cost that criminals face is the risk of imprisonment. And Becker thought up this theory when he was running late to examine a student. and he realized that if he parked illegally, then he would make it to the examination hall on time, and he would be spared embarrassment. So he weighed up the benefits of avoiding embarrassment against the costs of possibly getting a parking ticket. That's a sort of a classic theory of rational crime. Becker then went into the examination room and asked the student how the student would develop a theory of rational crime. Great news, of course, about this story is that Becker didn't get a ticket and the student passed, so it's sort of happy all round.
Everyone won.
Everyone's a winner. So that's sort of a classic idea of, criminals think about the risk of punishment when they contemplate whether they're going to commit a crime or not. Now, what the logic of life does is to say, okay, fine, that's a nice idea. Becker's a very creative thinker, very influential, very respected. Is it true? A 75-year-old economics professor weighs up costs and benefits before committing a parking offense. Does a 15-year-old with a knife or with a gun think about the risks of punishment before he goes out to commit a crime against property or to commit a violent crime, to stab somebody, to rob somebody? Does he actually weigh up the risks of punishment? And it turns out that in this particular case, yes, he does. Not all the time, and not all the time by any means. Some crimes are very irrational, but often enough that we can measure with very, very creative, very clever empirical work, we can measure the effect of harsher prison sentences, and they do deter juvenile delinquents. So that's an example, first of the theory and how the theory sort of comes about, but can be quite whimsical. We have these rather odd economists thinking about, theorizing about parking offences, and then the empirical evidence, which comes about from comparing different states with different punishment systems for juveniles and for adults, and asking what happens when a juvenile delinquent crosses the age from the juvenile punishment system to the adult punishment system, and what difference does the severity of the punishment make? Very, very clever piece of research. That's what's going on in the logic of life. It's an attempt to take these theories seriously, but at the same time to confront them with some evidence.
One of the main thrusts of the book is that a lot of the quote-unquote bad things we see in life, you mentioned crime, but there's prostitution, there's various other things that you go over in the book that people consider to be unsavory activities. They come about because of rational motivations then.
They do. I mean, the fact that we are often rational doesn't mean that the world is a beautiful place. So, for one thing, things like gambling, smoking, even using heroin can have personal benefits, and so even rational people might end up using them, using addictive substances or gambling or whatever. That's something I explore in the book. I think it's one of the most controversial ideas in the book. But also, just because individuals are taking rational decisions for themselves doesn't mean that the social outcome is rational. The most obvious example is pollution. We all individually do things that emit pollution, and everyone else has to pick up the tab for that. But there are other less familiar examples in the book. So one of them is a very, very powerful idea that racial segregation that can come about, even though nobody actually wants to live in a segregated society, or even if nobody wants to live in a segregated society, if people just have quite mild preferences for the sorts of neighborhoods they want to live in. I'm very happy to live in a mixed neighborhood, but I would like maybe one or two neighbors who are like me, who are the same ethnic group as me. If I'm black, I want one or two black neighbors. If I'm white, I want one or two white neighbors. If people just have these, I think, fairly mild preferences, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Tom Schelling showed that a sort of strange chain reaction, a kind of avalanche can take place, whereby the entire neighborhood ends up being segregated, despite the fact that everybody was happy to live in a mixed neighborhood. So I'm certainly not trying to present a Panglossian view that because we're all rational, the world is a wonderful place. Many, many examples of people making rational decisions that lead to outcomes that are very unpleasant for society.
The world then at a macro level can give you the impression that things are a lot worse than actual people are. The people don't have these preferences for the bad things that go on at a macro level. They just happen because of the aggregated actions and motivations.
That can certainly be true. I mean, I'm not saying that there are no such thing as bad people and no such thing as stupid people.
Yeah.
Of course, there are both. But it's very important to understand that some of the behavior that we see and some of the outcomes that we see, whether we're talking about traffic jams or whether we're talking about prostitutes not using condoms, this is not necessarily just because people are stupid, just because people don't understand. These are problems that are not going to be fixed simply by educating people. Actually, there's something more fundamental going on here. People are responding to the incentives that they face. And if you want to change the outcomes that we see, if you want prostitutes to use condoms, if you want to get rid of traffic jams, you have to change the incentives. You can't just launch some moral crusade or a few educational workshops. It's more profound than that, unfortunately.
Now, when people say, or at least when I talk to them about rational choice theory, and they say, well, there's no way that humanity can be rational, look at the state of the world. Is that the sort of thing we have going on where the state of the world doesn't fully represent the rationality of individual humans?
That's absolutely true. And it's true on a number of levels. So on the aggregate level, one of the reasons the world is a crazy place is because politics is pretty messed up. People make very shallow political decisions. They vote for politicians on the basis of sound bites or on the basis of I think, fairly superficial impressions. So I'm very struck by the fact that you look at the Democratic primary, Hillary Clinton's supporters are white like her, older like her, women like her. Barack Obama's supporters are young like him, often black like him. What's going on here? I mean, is this really a rational evaluation of the quality of the candidates, or are people just going on their gut feeling? And I think that's broadly true about politics. In the book, I show there's nothing irrational about that. What would be irrational was if people spent a tremendous amount of time and effort trying to inform themselves and make an informed vote. Because we all know that actually our individual vote very rarely makes the difference in an election on a presidential level. It has never made a difference in an election, and it never will. Our aggregate voters, of course, makes the difference, but we don't cast an aggregate vote. We only cast an individual vote. So I ask people to imagine going to the polls to vote in a primary or to vote in a presidential election, and then on the way back from the polling booth, stopping off at an electronics warehouse and buying a big flat-screen TV, and contemplating doing that tomorrow. What rationally would you do this evening? Would you spend your time reviewing the speeches of the candidates, consulting policy documents, or would you look at reviews of flat-screen TVs? And it turns out, well, you would look at reviews of flat-screen TVs because you know that if you make a bad choice in your purchase of flat-screen TV, you could waste thousands of dollars. It's actually going to make an impact in your quality of life. Whereas if you make a bad choice in your vote, well, the whole of America suffers because you made a stupid vote, but you don't suffer because your single vote is never going to affect the election. So I don't think it's very surprising that we can have smart people and we can have dumb politics. And, of course, dumb politics is a leading cause of misery in the world. So that's going on. Something else I think that's very important, when people think about rational choice theory and they say, oh, look, this is crazy, there's no way that people could possibly be rational, I know my reply is, well, there's no way that, in theory, there's no way that people could possibly, say, catch a football. We know that if you throw a football, the path that the football describes can be expressed in terms of mathematical equations, the spin of the ball, the friction, gravitational pull. And if you were very, very smart and you had lots of time, you could actually calculate the path of the football using mathematics. But most of us actually don't have the mathematical skills to do that. And even those of us who do have the mathematical skills to do that, we could never do it quickly enough to actually catch the ball. So you could say, well, look, in theory, no one can catch a football. But, you know, if I threw you a football, you'd catch it. And certainly wide receivers, they catch footballs. I don't ever see them getting out, pocket calculators or pen and paper. So it turns out that we are making these calculations as to how to catch a ball very, very quickly and subconsciously. There's something going on in our brain that solves the maths and spits out the answer. Now, I argue that the same thing could, in principle, be true of weighing up these costs and benefits. There's no reason why we couldn't think about the consequences of our actions subconsciously. There's no reason why we couldn't subconsciously weigh up risks and rewards when it comes to our diet, when it comes to the risks we take with drugs or with sex, when it comes to the actions we make in the workplace, all kinds of things. There's no reason in principle why we couldn't subconsciously be doing that because the brain's an amazing organ. The question is, do we actually do that? Are we actually rational, or are we actually a bunch of irrationalities and quirks and neuroses? And so that's why, again, I emphasize the need for looking at the evidence in the book. The book is full of evidence, very, very Economists have got, I think, very, very clever about looking for evidence and very pragmatic. So some of the evidence comes from standard statistical work, but very, very brilliantly done with a lot of new data, looking at data from anything from internet dating or speed dating to data from the American Time Use Survey. But economists are also carrying out experiments. They put people in laboratories. They put people in brain scanners. They examine lab rats in cages. How do they behave? They also have persuaded charities and governments and big corporations to run social experiments, big randomized trials, the same way you would try out a new medicine, you actually might try out a new policy. So I think they've got very pragmatic about the way they produce their evidence, and that was one of the fun things about writing the book, was to discover all the different ways that you can investigate how humans behave and what we actually do.
If you're just tuning in, my guest is Tim Harford, the Undercover Economist, author of The Logic of Life, The Rational Economics of an Irrational World. What does that reveal about how the economics profession has changed? What were economists doing before that was so different from all this exciting stuff with pragmatic evidence that they're doing now?
A few years ago, economics books were very theoretical. They were almost like logic texts. And I enjoyed those books, but there was a change with Freakonomics and much more focus on actually going out into the world and discovering things. And that wasn't just some rhetorical shift that popular economics writers suddenly got smart and discovered a more interesting branch of economics. It reflects the shift in economics. I think 10 years ago there was much less of an emphasis on evidence. There was much more an emphasis on theory. Theory was what was most respected. Theory was what was winning Nobel Prizes. Theory was what was getting you tenure at university. So it's partly a change in preference in the economics profession that empirical work is now more respected. There's also partly a change in the tools available for the job. The man who taught me economic statistics, who is now retired, he related the story of back in the 1950s trying to calculate some pretty basic statistical operation that an economist would now do without thinking by just pressing a button. And it took him 12 weeks. 12 weeks just to do one sum. That was just necessary for doing quite a simple piece of statistical analysis. And because it took so long to do these sorts of calculations and to check them, statistical work, empirical work, tended to be fairly rudimentary, fairly rare, and the kind of thing that you would offload to grunts. You know, you wouldn't do it if you were one of the high priests of economics.
Exactly.
Now it's got much easier because we have much more powerful computers, and we also have, because we have the ability to carry out this statistical work. There's also a lot more demand for numbers to crunch. People are going out there and producing numbers in clever ways or finding numbers in clever ways. So one of the favorite pieces of work in the book, not ever going to win the Nobel Prize, it's not an earth-shaking piece of work, but it's just a lot of fun, was two economists who persuaded a very large speed dating company to share, anonymized, all this data on speed dating. So all the people who turned up for a speed date would have told the speed dating company about their income, their height, their weight, whether they were smokers or non-smokers, what education they had, did they have a PhD, had they dropped out of high school, all that sort of stuff. And then at the speed date, each person would meet 20 other people and would say, oh, I'm interested in seeing this person again, or I'm not interested in seeing this person again. And so you have this amazing data set about how people dated, who people liked and what they liked. Did they like smokers or non-smokers? How many dates did they propose? And you would never have been able to get hold of this data 10 or 15 years ago without binoculars and a very good lawyer. So it's just things have just changed. So it's a really fun piece of research. What they discovered, by the way, that I think won't be surprising, is that men propose many, many more dates than women, more than twice as many dates as women. But also, I think something that might be more surprising is that people's standards when they're out dating are very responsive to, well, there's no nice way to put this, to the market opportunity. So on speed dating evenings where there are lots and lots of tall, dark, handsome people actually, the people who might propose dates to them start to become more picky. They think, well, actually there are a lot of tall, dark, handsome people around. I want someone who's really tall and really handsome. Whereas on speed dating evenings where the pickings are a little slim, people are less rich, they're less educated, they're less attractive for dating purposes, people lower their standards because they think, well, I mustn't be so fussy. So it's the romantic view of life isn't I'm afraid backed up by the evidence. We're actually demand response to supply when it comes to dating. So that gives you an idea of not the most serious research in the book, but the sort of fun that economists are having.
Well, the logic of life it's jam-packed full of so many neat ideas, and one of the ones I wanted to be sure to mention was the explanation of high CEO pay, and it's one of the most convincing that I've read in recent years, and it's that, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the high CEO salary and stock options, that is a motivator more to those under the CEO who want his position, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Economists don't even pretend that the CEO actually deserves what he or she is paid. It's like a sort of lifetime achievement award for someone who's long since been removed from the productive flow. In the chapter, there's other stuff going on, but I think this is the fun bit, and I think this explains a lot of what's happening. It's called tournament theory. The idea is that pay in many corporations is set up in a very competitive way. So you don't pay people for doing well in some absolute sense. If everybody does well, we'll pay you all more. If everyone does badly, we'll pay you all less. Instead, corporations often find it rational to pit staff against each other. So if you do better than all your co-workers, you win the prize, and the prize is a bonus, or maybe the prize is promotion to the next level. And of course, the prizes have got to get bigger and bigger to keep the motivation up. And the grand prize is to be the boss. And the wonderful thing about this theory, or maybe the horrible thing about this theory, is that the less work the boss has to do and the more egregious the boss's pay packet and working conditions, the more of a prize it is. So the boss himself or herself doesn't necessarily need to do anything to have earned the prize. Merely the fact that it is a big fat paycheck is a motivator for everybody else down the corporate ladder. So I explain there are a lot of wrinkles in that idea, and why would anybody organize a corporation that paid people in this way, etc. I explore all of that and the evidence behind that, but I find it pretty persuasive. It's also an explanation, incidentally, of office politics. The evidence is that corporations that use this sort of competitive tournament pay structure, they do provoke harder work, longer hours from their employees. They also provoke all sorts of backstabbing and refusal to cooperate. So people do respond very rationally to the incentive that these competitive pay structures give them. So it's rational office politics, I'm afraid.
And there's another idea you cover in the book that I thought was just the coolest thing. You have a chapter about cities called The World is Spiky, and you describe how cities are expensive, and we all know that. And, of course, they have the cultural amenities and the restaurants, but they cost more on top of the very high rent already. But the premium you're getting there, it's paying for the increased exchange of ideas. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I should say, by the way, I feel bad about this. The phrase "the world is spiky" was coined by Richard Florida, who has his own book out this month, which I recommend thoroughly. Richard and I are really exploring slightly different ideas in the book, but I just thought his phrase "the world is spiky" was just perfect. So I pinched it, and now I feel guilty. There's a footnote somewhere in the book that says this is Richard Florida's idea, but no one reads the footnote. So I wanted to admit that. Anyway, to having got that off my chest. The idea in that chapter is to explore, is information technology really flattening the world and making it less and less important to live in cities? And it really seems that it isn't. And there are a lot of reasons why that is. One is that email, mobile phones, all that kind of thing, they seem to be making it easier to live in cities, not more difficult. They make it easier to see your friends. They make it easier to collaborate, just to manage the complexity of city life. To return to dating for a second, a very simple, straightforward example is internet dating. If you live in a village out in Nebraska and you know everybody you're ever going to meet, internet dating isn't a lot of use to you because all the people you might actually end up marrying, you've met, right? It's a small community. Whereas if you live in Los Angeles or New York, internet dating is fantastic because it allows you to meet potentially the people who would match you perfectly from a pool of 5 or 10 million people. That's a silly example, but I think it's revealing about the way that internet technology actually strengthens cities. And the evidence is that people who live in cities, superficially we find the people who live in cities are paid more. And there are lots of possible explanations for that. But when you look more closely at what's going on, it turns out it's not people who live in cities who are paid more. It's people who have lived in cities for an extended period of time. The longer you live in a city, the more you earn. And that's true even if you then move to the country. You still keep your city bonus. If you live in the country for a while, your pay doesn't increase so much. And then when you move back to the city, it starts to increase again. And that's consistent with the idea that in cities, we're getting a lot of free lessons. Cities are amazing universities of life.
You call this the knowledge spillover.
We're bumping into people. We're picking up ideas all the time. The logical implication of this, by the way, is that the government should be subsidizing cities, but that obviously doesn't go down too well as a policy proposal. But I think the evidence that this is how cities work is compelling. There's a wonderful, very, very new piece of research, by the way, on the importance of proximity, even in a digital world, that I just think is fantastic. It comes from Google, not Google the search engine, but the physical Google campus. And the researchers in Google have found that they looked at who in Google knew the same things at the same time. They had a way of measuring who knew what at the same time that I think was a quite persuasive measure. And they said, well, what determines who knows the same stuff? Is it the people who are friends with each other? Is it demographic characteristics, which they won't say what those are, but probably age, race, sex? Are those what determine who knows the same stuff? Or is it who's on the same project team, or who has the same boss? Or is it people who are friends with each other? What determines it? And it turns out it's none of those things. What really determines who knows the same stuff at the same time is people who sit next to each other. And the Google being Google, they actually had the GPS coordinates of each person's desk. And it turns out it was physical proximity that determined who knew the same stuff, which is fascinating because we're talking about a company like Google. I mean, if there was ever a company where physical proximity didn't matter and it was all about digital communication, surely it was Google. But even in Google, where you sit determines what you know.
This is digital technology, social networking, and real life working better together than any isolated.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is the sort of thing you cannot come up with just as a theory. You can't sit down at your desk and think, I wonder if the world works like this or not. You have to get out there and grab hold of the evidence. And the evidence comes from very, very disparate things. Everything from this research in Google to looking at internet dating, to looking at wages, to looking at rents. Lots and lots of different ways of trying to close in on the same answer.
And in the final chapter of the book, if I'm not mistaken, this is what you put down all the advancement humanity has ever had to, is this increasing exchange of ideas with increasing population.
Yeah, I mean, the last chapter of the book is a million years of logic, and it's where, I have to admit, I get very speculative. I'm just playing with ideas, but there are some very, very interesting ideas floating around. So I look at things like, what determines the growth rate of the world economy from 1 million BC onwards. And the one thing that seems to predict global economic growth all the way back to 1 million BC, where there weren't even human beings, we're talking about Neanderthals, and we're talking about humans, Homo sapiens, very primitive ancestors. The thing that really seems to have determined growth all the way back is the total population of the world. The more people there are on the world, the faster the world economy grows, and it's been accelerating ever since. Because of course, more people means more ideas, means more people, means more ideas, means more people, means more ideas. It is amazing how strong the relationship is. The basic idea is, in a world where you've only got a few million people, if somebody comes up with a brilliant idea like the wheel or fire, there are only a few million people to share in that idea to use it, because everyone can use the same idea. Today's world, where we have 6.5 billion people, someone comes up with a brilliant idea, faster microchip or an energy-saving piece of technology, 6.5 billion people can enjoy that. That's one of the things I look at in the book. I also look at evidence from wind patterns in the Pacific. Or does that tell us anything about which colonial powers were the most despotic and which colonial powers were the best for economic growth of the islands they colonized? Because it turns out that the Pacific winds and Pacific currents created a natural experiment. I look at why the Neanderthals died out. I look at the origins of the Industrial Revolution, which were the most impressive cities in medieval Europe. Really just having a lot of fun with different ideas. I wouldn't take that last chapter too seriously as a piece of economic history, but as just playing around with the sort of creative ideas that economists have come up with. I was having fun by then.
Now, we've only got a couple minutes left on this week's show, but I wanted to find out, back to your days when you were young and innocent of economic principles, what lured you into the field of economics?
Oh, it was pure accident. I studied philosophy, politics, and economics, which is a degree subject notorious for people who really don't know what they're going to do with their lives. And I always thought that I would be a philosopher. I thought, perhaps naively, I thought, oh, that sounded cool. I could tell people I was a philosopher or something. Turns out I wasn't really very good at philosophy, and unexpectedly, I really enjoyed the economics. So in my first year of college, before I decided what to major in, I was working hard on the philosophy and getting nowhere, and the philosophy department were telling me, you know, you're not really very good at this subject. And at the same time, I kept trying to goof off on the economics and, you know, skip the lectures of economics, and I did skip all the stuff about inflation, unemployment, all that stuff, and never really did catch up because I thought I would never need it. But I kept bumping into economic ideas that I thought, wow, this is actually really interesting. This is about how real people behave. This is everyday stuff. So I was hooked. I was pushed by the philosophy department, and I was pulled by economics, and I'm very lucky to have stumbled across the subject.
You were won over by the sheer relevance of it all.
Absolutely, and that sounds so strange, economics relevant, but it really is. I see economics around me every day. I think if you know how to look, and hopefully my books will tell people how to look, other people can see that too.
The book, one more time, is The Logic of Life, The Rational Economics of an Irrational World. Tim Harford, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the Marketplace of Ideas.
Thank you very much.
Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. Check out his website, Ben Althouse, that's BenAlthouse.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com.